A resident scholar here at the American Enterprise Institute, and I'd like to welcome you to our session this morning on the TPP, TTIP, and the future of digital trade, with a keynote by Ambassador Robert Holleyman. Before we get to the program, let me briefly note that this is Digital Week or Internet Week at AEI, and let me point you to another session we'll be having on Capitol Hill next week to present a report, a digital agenda for the United States, which has been in the making for 2 years, actually. It's a report that is based on discussions that we scholars at AEI have had with a variety of stakeholders, with academics, Silicon Valley, with the administration, with the foreign representatives. And basically the aim is to give or project a set of recommendations for the end of this administration to some degree, but more fully to the next administration and the next president, whoever he or she might be. I would commend it to you. We are kicking off, as I say, on Capitol Hill on Tuesday. You can find the details on our website. The keynotes there will be Senator Cory Gardner for the Republicans and Senator Mark Warner for the Democrats. I think this is an issue that is not so much partisan, but it's nice to have some representatives from both parties. So I recommend that to you. For our session today, before I introduce Robert Holleyman, I should say that Robert Holleyman will start off with an address, a statement, and then we will go to a kind of mini roundtable for the next 20 minutes or so. We've invited our colleague Josh Meltzer, whom I will introduce more formally in a minute, or in a little while, and then we'll go to questions and answers from the audience. I should say that it's a real pleasure for me personally to welcome Robert Holleyman to AEI. We go back a long way. We won't go into that, but it really is, as I say, a particular pleasure for me to have him here. And in one of the last, I would say this is one of the last sessions that AEI will be having in this building. And we promise to invite you back when we go into that small Andrew Mellon mansion up on Massachusetts Avenue. As Adam Posen of the Peterson Institute said, with AEI coming, there goes the neighborhood. At any rate, as many of you in this audience know, Robert Holleyman is the Deputy U.S. Trade Representative, and his responsibilities include intellectual property, investment, digital issues. I'm sure he's the point man on all of the digital trade issues that we'll be dealing with this morning. He is also responsible for East Asia, so we expect him to be able to tell us at some point exactly when the Congress is going to pass the TPP at some point in the discussion. Before that, those of us in Washington who've known him for a long time knew him as the president and CEO of the Software Business Alliance, Robert got in on the beginning of all of this and rode this really to the top before he retired in 2013. Before that, he was a congressional staff member. And so without taking any more time, let me introduce Robert Holleyman. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you, Claude, and thanks everybody for being here this morning. I'm delighted to have a chance to talk with you about digital trade, the digital agenda, and delighted that my good friend Claude Barfield, who's been working on these issues for many years now, and extended this invitation for me to join you. I'm pleased to be joined by two of my colleagues from USTR, Jonathan McHale, who was one of the chief authors of many of the digital provisions, all of the digital provisions we're talking about today, Jennifer Thornton, who's my senior counsel, and with them and an incredibly dedicated group of appointees and career officials at USTR. We look to make a difference in trying to address trade barriers that are both existing and planned, that would have an adverse effect on free trade, on American innovation, and indeed the work that we're doing around digital trade, particularly looking at the starting point of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, is really the hallmark of our effort to ensure that the kind of digital future that we envision and that we have understood in this country can be brought to bear, and we can prevent the erection of trade barriers that would otherwise harm this vibrant part of our economy. But let me step back for just a moment to say that I think 2016 has already, in this first half of the year, been quite a momentous time for proponents of free and expanded trade. Back in February of this year, the U.S. and 11 of our trading partners gathered to sign the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And this agreement brought together countries with whom we have existing FTAs, like Australia, Canada, Mexico, Chile, and others, Singapore and others. And it's brought into the full array a mix of other countries like Japan, where I think the U.S. would have aspired for decades to have a potential free trade agreement, to Vietnam, the first communist country with whom we've ever negotiated a free trade agreement. And through this realm of 12 countries, we've created a series of high standard rules that really open up markets to American exports in a whole host of areas ranging from agriculture to services to manufacturing, that build in new levels of protection for the environment, to ensure the right of workers to organize, to have safe working conditions, but also bring in truly 21st century trade. And among the 21st century trade disciplines, we have what we've called our digital 24. And I think there are fact sheets on most of your tables, and I'll talk about some of those key principles. But this negotiation, which was 5.5 years in the making, was intense because it involved 12 parties with all their sensitivities, with different levels of development, with different models of governance. And through this part, we managed to find that perfect moment where all of those parties were able to come together and affirm TPP as a way of raising standards for trade around the world, for promoting greater economic integration, for spurring growth, and for raising living standards. TPP will do more to open markets to manufactured goods, services, and agriculture than any previous trade agreement. It will break new ground in addressing trade-related issues ranging from cutting fishing subsidies that deplete valuable fishing stocks to imposing disciplines on state-owned enterprises, which are more than ever factors in the global commerce of state-owned enterprises, and how do we ensure that they're right disciplines to ensure that when they are present in a market, they are acting on commercially viable terms, and that they're not getting support or subsidies from their governments that would give them an unfair ability to compete. So things like SOEs are part of this. And we will have our new digital trade rules that represents what trade policy looks like in the digital era. And I would add, not just because of what that means for technology companies. In fact, that's probably the smallest portion of the value of the digital trade rules. But the biggest portion relies for all of the rest of our economy, where we understand in this country how our digital assets have enabled us to reach customers, to manage our supply chain, to understand our business, to get to market in ways that are more affordable And so our digital trade rules are intended to be underpinnings for the entire economy, not just the tech industry. At the same time that we celebrate the success of 5.5 years of effort, we also know that opponents of trade are very vocal, and they often focus on what they perceive as the adverse impact of trade agreements on domestic labor conditions. But let me add, what they are focusing on is actually the impact of trade. It is trade agreements by which we manage and set the rules around how we compete in a globally competitive environment. Now, many of the concerns about trade are real, and they need a response. And so we have mechanisms that range from trade adjustment assistance, goals around ensuring better education, better scientific research, better infrastructure, and other means so that Americans can take full advantage of our strengths as a nation and our strengths as individuals. But the critics of trade also ignore, or perhaps assume as natural, the aggregate benefits of trade for both consumers and workers. The roughly $13,000 in added purchasing power that the post-war liberalization of the American market has brought to American families, and the fact that export-related jobs in America pay up to 18% more on average than non-export-related jobs. And that's not a surprising statistic when you simply account for the fact that as you increase the number of potential customers and the number of markets where you are selling your product or service, that increases your pricing power. And that enables you to pay your workers more. The critics of trade also miss an important point about the future. An open and fair trading system encourages the efficient allocation of resources and incentivizes countries to invest in sectors in which they already enjoy distinct competitive advantages. Now, these are academic terms, but they bear directly on our topic today. The internet, the global digital economy, and the promise they offer for the United States, and the risk to all three that the TPP agreement can help to avert. So let's start for a moment with where we are now. The U.S. is home to 11 out of the 15 largest internet-related businesses in the world. The U.S. enjoys a huge comparative advantage in digital technology. China is home to the remaining 4 largest internet-related businesses. No companies from Brazil, Canada, the EU, India, Japan, or Korea crack the top 15. According to a 2011 McKinsey study, the U.S. captures more than 30% of the global internet revenue and remains the largest player in internet supply ecosystem, meaning that the lion's share of the hardware, software, and services required to build and operate the internet are produced by American companies, by American workers, and by American research labs, fueled by great American universities. McKinsey speculates that our dominance in this sector is attributable to 4 factors. 1, the quality of our internet infrastructure. 2, the ability of our universities and tech companies to attract top talent. 3, the access of our small and medium enterprises and entrepreneurs to efficient capital markets. And 4, a business climate that encourages innovation through a combination of factors including limited regulation, strong and balanced IPR protection, tax incentives, and low levels of corruption. The result of this is a U.S. digital economy that continues to grow rapidly and indeed continued to grow rapidly throughout the Great Recession. It will contribute $1 trillion of national GDP this year, U.S. $1 trillion, that is, of a U.S. $17 trillion GDP. and $1 trillion of the $73 trillion global GDP. Now, the ability of our tech innovators to maintain this digital dominance depends in no small measure on the ability to access foreign markets. The numbers speak for themselves. 20 years ago, the 20 million US internet users at that time made up 61% of the global community of 35 million internet users. Today, 286 million US internet users account for less than 10% of the 3.4 billion connected people worldwide. Therefore, access to the millions of consumers and businesses online in the United States may not be enough to support our industry and may not be enough to support all those industries as part of this digital ecosystem. Today, to truly scale, our digital entrepreneurs need to access markets beyond the US, where 95% of the world's consumers and businesses reside. Now, let's think about where we might be in a decade. For our companies seeking to provide digital products and internet-enabled services to consumers around the world, growth in the Asia-Pacific market cannot be ignored. I'm just back Wednesday night from being in China and spent a lot of my time working in Asia-Pacific, and I'm always struck by the data and the numbers. Brookings estimated that in 2009, there were 500 million middle-class consumers in Asia. It projects that 14 years from today, that number will be 3.2 billion middle-class consumers in Asia. 3.2 billion middle-class consumers in Asia. I think that point cannot be overstated because of the significance of both the rate of growth and the rate of growing economic power. And so the question is, in all of this, how do we, from the strengths in our US market, take advantage of the opportunities that lie in the fastest growing markets in the world? So for our companies and manufacturers who are developing things like the Internet of Things, the numbers are equally staggering. According to Cisco, in 2010, there were 12.5 billion connected devices. By 2020, that number will rise to 50 billion. The advances in the Internet of Things, or what some might refer to as the industrial internet, have the potential to unleash significant new productivity gains for our manufacturers and to make American products even more competitive through related services. For example, through data analytics, heavy equipment manufacturers like Caterpillar can help their customers minimize fuel cost and monitor performance and utilize rates of productivity to help as they manage their supply stream and their maintenance costs. Companies like GE have been able to dramatically reduce the cost of manufacturing component parts through additive manufacturing or 3D printing. GE is also developing cloud-based software platforms that will enable not only its own manufacturing, but other manufacturers to convert operational data into information that they can use in real time. Companies like IBM are using big data analytics to facilitate the delivery of municipal services, helping cities to manage their electrical grids, conserve water, help transit systems run smoothly. And Microsoft is similarly using its cloud platform to enable remote monitoring and to facilitate predictive maintenance of oil pipelines and other infrastructure systems. Now, the ability of our tech entrepreneurs to reach new customers and the ability of our manufacturers to maximize the potential productivity gains associated with the industrial internet depends in no small measure on unrestricted data flows. According to McKinsey, digital flows now exert a larger impact on GDP growth than the century-old trade in goods. As digitally intensive industries expand internationally, they are seeking to maximize economies of scale by processing and storing their data in locations across the entire geographical network. For example, a smartphone operator might have access to data stored in the United States and Japan when serving a customer in Korea. And a bank in Singapore might need to give its employees access to software hosted in the United States to better market its products. As more consumers connect, as we build on the network effects, and as technology improves, the stuff of science fiction is indeed becoming closer to reality and closer to an essential part of how businesses across our economy operate. We can imagine, for example, the emergence of entirely new fields of exports in telemedicine and data analytic research, distance education, among others. And as a leading innovator and the world's largest services exporter, the United States is primed to excel in these areas. We already export more digitally capable services than the second and third ranking exporting countries combined. Now, all of this will create a world in which we're able to take advantages of our strengths and our comparative advantage in ways that we have not yet been able to do, absent the kind of new trade agreements that we're striking in this area. Now, a world in which Americans have more good opportunities, a world in which our exports do more to support U.S. growth, and a world in which we supply the world's people with a steady stream of new digital products and services, is one that will promote growth and raise living standards. Unfortunately, the work to make this future a reality is one where we need urgency to address the spreading policy challenges. In the past few years, many of our trading partners have called for greater restrictions on cross-border data flows for the ostensible purpose of protecting privacy and national security, but in fact, the goals are more pernicious than that. For example, India currently requires major internet companies to locate their servers in their country. Indonesia has an entire raft of rules that mandate the use of local data centers in their country. Turkey has implemented a data localization rule for certain internet-related services that's so stringent that it's caused at least one major foreign firm out of the U.S. to abandon the market. And Korea has taken an extreme position on privacy by restricting a broad range of data from being exported. Other countries, like Russia, have adopted more pernicious policies designed to erect digital borders and limit the democratizing effects of the internet. Indeed, in China, where I was this week, a wide-sweeping cybersecurity law is being proposed and may go to a second reading this month that could impose both severe restrictions on cross-border data flows, intrusive requirements around source code, as well as monitoring in ways that would be harmful for the flow of digitally intensive products and services. Now, if these policies are allowed to proliferate, they have the potential to destroy the efficient market for the delivery of goods and services that the internet provides. And without the right trade rules in place, these barriers will continue to grow and proliferate. And if we allow digital bridges to be replaced with digital walls, we risk forfeiting not only the current benefits of the digital economy, but its potential future and our potential aspirations. So why is an upgrade needed in our trade rules, and why is there urgency around this? Well, with the right rules in place, we can help ensure that our innovators and entrepreneurs get a fair shot. With the right rules in place, our innovators can shoot for the moon. With the right rules in place, we can unleash the next wave of digital stars. Trade policy has a critical and indeed essential role to play in giving American innovators a fair shot at success in the global playing field. Indeed, many of the digital products and services we enjoy today were facilitated by the smart and forward-looking trade policies that were put into place during the 1990s, when cross-border digital trade barely existed. For example, the last major upgrade in trade rules incorporated several key concepts that enabled the digital economy to prosper and grow to where it is today. For example, when the WTO members negotiated the General Agreement on Trade and Services, the GATS, they agreed their willingness to liberalize a particular sector would not depend upon the means by which that service is delivered. As a consequence, commitments to liberalize trade in banking applied to internet banking once that technology evolved. Similarly, the GATS Telecommunications Annex in the Financial Services Understanding included provisions designed to ensure access to networks for the purpose of moving data cross borders. And you don't have to look much farther than to see the positive impacts today of our forward-looking trade rules from the mid-1990s. Just look at the market cap in the technology sector. In 1995, the market cap of the top 100 since 1995, the market cap of the top 100 U.S. tech companies has grown by nearly $3 trillion. That dramatic growth proves the importance of forward-looking rules, but 20 years is a long time to wait between upgrades. In the meantime, our policies have not kept pace with the fundamental changes in the global economy. Simply put, what got us here and what enabled this digital innovation we see is no longer sufficient to take us where we need to go. And that brings us to TPP. Throughout the 5 years of the talks, we fought for rules that will combat digital protectionism, that will combat forced localization of data, and other negative trends that are counterintuitive, counterproductive to the mobile, cloud-based environment in which we operate today. We fought for and secured principles that will encourage innovation, support the free flow of ideas, and protect personal privacy. We brought home a policy architecture that's constructed around keeping the internet open and free. And indeed, this is the first trade agreement in history with comprehensive rules to do just that. In fact, TPP contains what I call and what we call our digital 24. Again, the handouts that are on your tables are an example of 24 of the cutting-edge obligations that are designed to support the growth of digital trade. And I'd emphasize that these are disciplines that do not exist in any trade agreement but for TPP. And absent TPP, we will lack the ability to argue for these type of provisions in other agreements and bilaterally. Let me break these 24 into kind of three broad categories. The first is a set of rules to ensure that the internet remains open to permit the free exchange of ideas, goods, and services, and that it's safe for both consumers and producers. These include rules requiring our trading partners to adopt enforceable consumer protections, rules that affirm the bedrock principle that consumers should be able to access online content and applications of choice for all legitimate commercial purposes. There's a second category of rules that are designed to eliminate and prevent policies designed to force the transfer of technology, or to restrict the flow of data, or to localize data processing services for protectionist purposes. These rules will prevent our trading partners from forcing companies to localize their computing services and enforcing companies to build expensive data centers in every market they seek to serve, or to rent those services from a local provider. Rules that prevent our trading partners from requiring companies to transfer their technology, their production processes, or their other proprietary information to persons in their respective territories as a condition for doing business there. Important in every context, but also important in a world where there are many SOEs. And what we do not want to have to do is transfer that proprietary information or processes as an ability to get access into a market, but you particularly don't want to do that if that government has state-owned enterprises who might otherwise gain access to your proprietary information or data as a way to improve and increase their competitive advantage over you. And also there's a third category that includes rules to protect our digital innovators and ensure that they can compete on a level playing field when they trade and do business abroad. These rules require the same appropriately strong and balanced copyright protections and enforcement provisions that are enshrined in U.S. law. They're rules that require partners to establish criminal procedures and penalties for trade secret theft, including by means of cyber theft, while at the same time preserving domestic laws that protect things like whistleblowing. Collectively, these achievements make TPP the first trade agreement with a comprehensive set of rules designed to keep the internet open and free. Now, many people, many experts, when they testified before the U.S. International Trade Commission on TPP, described these provisions as the most transformative measures in the entire TPP agreement. Indeed, as the ITC observed in its May 18th report to Congress on TPP, these provisions, quote, will likely strengthen the competitive advantage that the U.S. has in many digital sectors, end quote, particularly those with relatively higher levels of digital intensity. And the TPP's scale is just as important as its quality. The TPP members account for nearly 40% of global GDP, and Cisco's 2016 Visual Networking Index suggests that the 12 TPP members are responsible for slightly over 40% of global internet traffic. That gives this agreement the weight, the heft, to shape a global future, to bend the policy of countries away from digital protectionism towards a future of openness, innovation, and if you'd like, of comparative advantage. That makes TPP the upgrade we so urgently need. Now, thankfully, that upgrade is now within our reach. The ratification process is the final step to make sure that TPP is a reality, and this agreement is now ripe for congressional consideration. Some have said, we've certainly read occasionally in the press, that Congress could take care of this in the coming years or in the next decade. Now, I say years. If you are an innovative business, even a year's delay can mean a lifetime. In the tech world, speed is survival. How many product cycles and opportunities could be lost if more digital barriers are erected year after year after year after year without a counterpoint? Other countries are not waiting for the U.S. to establish the rules of trade in this area. The longer we delay, the further alternative, less open models advance. Since 2000, some 100 trade agreements have been completed in the Asia-Pacific region alone, and none have TPP's rules to promote a free and open internet. In fact, negotiations on the 16-nation Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, or RCEP, the China-led alternative to TPP, are projected to be completed later this year. In addition to China, countries ranging from Indonesia to India to Japan are part of RCEP. And we know that the composition of that agreement will not include provisions like those in TPP designed to promote a free and open internet. According to one study on the cost of failing to pass TPP, Americans would pay a heavy cost, an estimated $94 billion in national income, or over $700 on average for every U.S. household. That says nothing about the longer-term costs that delay could impose as digital protectionism continues to climb, raising costs for internet users, curtailing global access to services, and stifling the innovation by denying digital entrepreneurs the platforms, technologies, and indeed the clouds of their choice. The more such policies proliferate in the absence of clear and strong rules, the greater the risk that those policies, that protectionism, will become an irreversible norm. Thankfully, as more people learn about the importance of leading on trade, support is growing around the country. Every day we're hearing from more Americans, and no one has more on the line than our innovators. That's why all of the leading technology industry groups have stepped up in support of TPP and the importance of leading on trade. Groups like ITI, TechNet, the Semiconductor Industry Association, software organizations, the Silicon Valley Leadership Group, the Tech CEO Council, the Telecommunications Industry Association, CompTIA, and the Internet Association, among others. They are unified in their belief and in our belief that the fundamental choice of the 21st century, that choice about whether an economy remains open or closed, will not be decided overnight. Winning the fight for openness is likely to be the work of a generation, but we must do what we can when we can to move in the right direction. If we continue today's achievements, including digital achievements, for granted, we'll overlook what needs to be done to enable tomorrow's innovations and the innovations that brings throughout our entire economy and to our entire ecosystem. Leadership on trade, leadership through U.S. trade policy, is, I will note, already having a positive impact outside of our TPP negotiations and partners. The groundbreaking work we've done in TPP has attracted interest from the European Union, from the World Trade Organization, from the G20, and others. We're also pursuing the same ambitious standards in our ongoing Trade and Services Agreement, or TISA. TISA's 23 participants account for nearly 40% of the world's market for services, a market valued at $55 trillion, or roughly half of the world's GDP. Given that we continue to enjoy a consistent surplus in the trade and services, and only 5% of U.S. service suppliers are currently engaged in international trade, we're working hard to agree upon a set of rules that will enable our digital service providers to capture significant new export opportunities. It's clear that we have a new baseline standard, a 21st century ambition in these areas. But if we lack the political will to ratify TPP soon, our ambition will yield few material benefits for our innovators. Indeed, it has the potential to allow a series of setbacks to be put in place barrier by barrier by barrier by barrier that will make it tougher and tougher and tougher for the innovation we've seen, for the entrepreneurship that we've seen to grow. Maintaining our comparative advantage in the digital economy is a matter of urgent economic necessity, which only underscores the need for immediate action. Thank you very much, and I look forward to being part of this conversation with Claude and Josh and with all of you. Thank you.
Thank you. Is this on? Can you hear me? Let me first more formally introduce Joshua Meltzer, who is a senior fellow in the Global Economy and Development Program at the Brookings Institution. He's also an adjunct professor at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. He is, at base, a transplanted Aussie who came to Brookings after having been the trade counselor in the Australian embassy here. And before that, he was in the Trade Department of the government of Australia. So I'm happy to have, and he is also, I should say, not least, written extensively on the issues of digital trade. So we're really delighted to have Joshua here. Joshua, why don't you get us started on some additional things that are on your mind?
Sure. Thanks, Claude, and thanks, Ambassador, for another very, I thought, thorough and extremely informative outline of all the very significant leadership roles I think that the US has been playing, certainly under your guidance in large part on this issue. Very significant, I think, and really transformative, I think, in the way that the rest of the world is beginning to think about these issues. I don't think this was on anyone's agenda that many years ago, and increasingly it is. I was in Europe, in Brussels last week, testifying before the Parliament on digital trade issues, and that experience. I mean, I think we all, for those of us who are talking on a transatlantic basis on these issues, there's a lot going on over there, which at sometimes probably causes some concern. But I think overall there is a desire to learn more about what the US is doing and to think a bit more deeply about what this might mean for their economy. I think on the one hand, there's a learning process in terms of realising the extent, and you talked about this in your speech a bit now, about how this is really not an IT issue alone. This is very much an economy-wide issue. Digital products, digital services affect businesses and their productivity and the ability to compete across every economic sector, really. The transatlantic relationship around this space has, in a sense, there's a separate discussion going on around privacy, and there was some success on the Privacy Shield, but there seems to be some pushback now on the European side in terms of whether that actually goes far enough. But it sort of seems to me that at least that is an important building block towards getting into a space with Europe where maybe there could be some productive conversations, whether in the transatlantic negotiating space and also I think probably in TISA on what could be done on digital trade issues. Europe's obviously a very important economy, developed with a significant digital presence, notwithstanding the fact that they don't have a large internet company. They do a lot on the content side and the app side and the like. I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit more maybe about what you might hope for in terms of leadership from Brussels and from Europe more broadly on this space. What could be done possibly in TTIP or elsewhere to really sort of start setting some global standards in this space?
Sure. Thank you. We believe strongly that privacy is a core value, not only in the U.S., but it's a core value in the digital economy and our trade policy. Privacy is a principle that is part of the Digital 2000, and it is both there to increase the level of confidence in consumers using the internet, but it's also to talk about the kind of values that we have that are protected both in our Constitution and through our array of privacy laws here in the U.S. I mean, this is really the basis on which we are negotiating the digital provisions in both TISA and the ones that we are discussing with the EU in the context of TTIP. I think there are probably two elements of this. One is what happens on the Privacy Shield that has been negotiated between the U.S. and the EU. Our colleagues at Commerce lead primarily on that, but I will say that we think that it is a standard that is objective, that it provides a high level of protection and insurance, and is necessary for digital trade between the U.S. and the EU to continue. So we hope that that is endorsed, that companies can abide by it, and we think it is a fundamental underpinning. Secondly, we think with that issue addressed, we have, through the model of TPP, a new means of talking about the importance of data flows and the importance of other information that, but for TPP, I would argue would not be necessarily ripe for consideration in either TTIP or TISA. I mean, this embrace of these principles by 40% of the global economy has really put wind in the sails behind what we're trying to do in these other negotiations, and they're the template for what we would like the outcome to be.
I wonder if you could be a little more specific. You've got, and you laid out what we got in the TPP. I realize you can't negotiate here with the Europeans at AEI, but where do you think, there's likely to be a lot of discussion in terms of what specifically you ticked off the 5 or 6 things, in terms of data localization, in terms of no transfer of technology, yada yada, that stuff. Where are we likely, not just with the TTIP, but with TISA? Because you mentioned also a group of nations that have introduced barriers. I'm not going to go through those, but that's the wall you are facing. So we've got this situation where we've got this great victory, transformative victory. I don't think anyone could disagree with that. But where do we go from here in the specifics of what you've got there?
Sure.
Your 2 dozen.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say that the countries who are moving most quickly to erect barriers are by and large not the countries who are negotiating TISA. So we benefit through the process where we don't see as much entrenched opposition to these provisions. Not that there's none, but we don't see as much entrenched opposition. I think the biggest barrier in both TISA and in TTIP that was a challenge was fundamentally addressing the privacy issues over which Privacy Shield is designed to complete. Because while that issue was and still is to some degree outstanding, our colleagues in the EU have been more reluctant to engage in this whole series of issues, while this big issue around privacy and Privacy Shield remains outstanding. But I think we've seen in the talks more discussion now around this. I can't get a breakdown where the pockets of opposition are, but I think the fact that we actually now talk about these not just as isolated elements, but as a 2 dozen, actually helps us socialize some of the elements of this that might be less well known, so that we make it clear that the entirety of this, the network effects of this, are what are good. And so I'd say that we are optimistic about our ability to get this in place, but I also think our trading partners, even in those negotiations, are watching keenly what's happening or not happening around TPP.
To pick on the Europeans, but I've written several pieces over the last months, and I realized, as a preface, it goes back to something that Joshua said, that a lot of these issues are not just USTR issues. I mean, not to be bureaucratic about it, they're not just formally trade issues. They involve things that would involve other, like the State Department or the Commerce Department, as you mentioned, with the Privacy Shield. But the point of my piece was it's astonishing to me that the U.S. government has not gotten involved in some fashion, whether it's state or you or commerce or whoever, the White House, in defending Google in its fight against the right to be forgotten in Europe. For those of you who, most of you probably do know, that there's a European rule now that says that if somebody complains, this is published data, complains about something that's out of date or inaccurate or just they don't want it up there, they can petition to have it removed. And the European Union, which has declared this privacy a human right, has turned over the administration of this human right to a private corporation. We're now in a situation that Google has been fined. It's going to go back up by the French authorities. It gets to another problem. It's not just the European Union. It's any of the European Union governments. And so while this is an issue that specific, obviously, since Google has 90% of the search traffic there. It's highly a corporate issue, but it's also an issue that has major implications for the internet globally. And it seems to me it's something that the U.S. government has a strong interest in. What is the argument against intervening?
Well, I mean, one, I agree that it is.
I don't own Google stock as far as I know.
I look. I agree. It's challenging. It's not at all clear that the objectives around a right to be forgotten can actually even be achieved, given the multiple sources to find that information that
Right.
through other mechanisms. But at the same time, it's not clear that there are a set of trade rules that can effectively discipline that process of asserting that there has to be a right to be forgotten. And finally, I think all of that ability of the U.S. to do anything potentially in that space has been clouded because of the debate around safe harbor and the privacy shield. I mean, it would be very difficult, if not impossible, for the U.S., even if we wanted to take on one issue like the right to be forgotten, which is important, but to take that on while the entirety of the safe harbor and the entirety of the ability to transfer information between the U.S. for all enterprises was halted and, in fact, in question. And so I think, some of that is just also a question of picking the places
So it's
where you
a question
think
of timing as much as anything else.
I think it's a question of timing, and then I think, if the timing were right, I think the U.S. would have to make a decision of, is that something where we had an ability to intervene? That's not a discussion that we've had, particularly while we're trying to get this big issue around privacy shield solved. So I don't know where the U.S. would come out on that. What I do know is we have a strong protection of privacy in this country. We need to affirm that, and we need the privacy shield to do that.
Josh, you want to?
Ambassador, I just want to pick up on one of the comments in your speech where you discussed some of the opportunities of the internet and open data flows for small businesses, the opportunity to use internet platforms to reach consumers globally, wherever they may be located, to overcome more traditional barriers to trade, and how this is not only an opportunity for small businesses in the US, but for businesses globally. And so in many respects, as you pointed out, I mean, the US gains a lot from this open architecture and the ability to move data globally, but this is an opportunity for countries around the world to give opportunities to their entrepreneurs to engage in the global economy, probably in ways that weren't there previously. As part of the process of negotiating TPP and travelling the world speaking to others on this issue, how do you find what have you found to be sort of the generalised responses to this set of rules? What do you identify in terms of socialising these two dozen? What are the hardest sort of barriers to get over in getting regulators and governments to understand why this might actually be in their broader economic interests?
Sure. I think there are really two. I think it started with other countries, including in the TPP negotiations, beginning with the principle of, we understand why the U.S. cares about this, but why should we care about it? And we understand that the U.S. is a digital leader. We understand why you'd want these things, but why does it matter to smaller countries or to emerging economies? I think that was the sort of first hurdle, and as we advance these and other fora, that's a fundamental hurdle. I mean, I talk about it personally because of looking at how the cloud computing environment architecture has dramatically changed the cost of innovation. And so one of the great democratizing, equalizing effects of the cloud is it is really made the cost of startups that are digitally intensive incredibly cheap. What used to have to work for a big company to have access to the computing resources, you can now, with a credit card or with very little information, start up one month, use the biggest data resources through a cloud provider that the largest corporations in the world would have. If that succeeds, you can scale up. If it fails, you close it down with very little upfront cost. That, I would argue, is a great equalizer, because that allows countries who may not have the broad infrastructure or may not have the large enterprises where their recent college grads or others can go to work for. That allows them to take that innovation from their home countries and to cheaply access that computing capacity and to bring the innovations to market. So that is a huge opportunity. And quite frankly, that opportunity doesn't work well if you were requiring your local entrepreneurs to use a cloud provider in their own country, because the economies of scale don't allow the cheap costs of massing computing to occur in every country at the same price. So we know it's the cheapest in the US to get access to our cloud resources. So this would allow an entrepreneur in Brunei or in Vietnam to have access to a cloud computing service at competitive prices. I think the second part of this has been really, the challenge of dealing with some incumbents in these own markets who don't want to give up their advantage. So the flip side of that is you have some local data storage providers who would like to build out their data centers, their cloud access, and they push their governments to say, make sure that all data is stored in our market, because they see bricks and mortars and servers as their key to the digital economy. In reality, that is the least valuable part of the digital economy. It raises the cost. Quite frankly, it raises the challenges around cybersecurity. Large global players do not want to have to chop up their data sets in every market, because every market in which you have to do it in storage increases a point of vulnerability into your system that both makes it less efficient but makes the system more vulnerable. So it's really kind of the two sides of that same coin. But I think the key ultimately is really to show what this can mean for their innovative startups. And there's no shortage of talent. There's no shortage of entrepreneurship. And if you can get people to see how this benefits them, I think that's helped us and will continue to help us.
I have one more question, and we will turn to the audience. Ambassador Holleyman has agreed to stay for a few minutes longer if we went over. We can't really have a session on trade without something about China as a question. So here's my question. Again, it's things that I've written here and get your reaction. As you know, the USTR and the Trade Estimates Report this year, for the first time, it may not be the first time, it's the first time it highlighted the fact that the Great Wall, the great software wall in China was a trade barrier. It represented a trade barrier. Is there any thinking, and outside academics have suggested this, and some, I think, business have suggested that it's time to test this in the WTO. There are WTO cases that are not, without getting into heavy-duty legal stuff here, just to say as a statement that there are cases in the WTO which look as if the appellate body and the panels would look in favor on going against the sweeping nature of the Great Wall in China. That is, the point is that in terms of Apple Books or Apple Music, yeah, if you don't like one book, okay, but you can't use that as an example to sweep Apple all the way out. Now, they haven't said that directly, but it looks as if that they might say that. Is there any thinking of going forward and testing those rules?
Sure. I think, China has a whole series of rules that are encompassed in the Great Firewall, but also then get into very specific things like the new cybersecurity law that I'm talking about that would restrict data flows, that has intrusive requirements to use local encryption standards. Again, the kind of things that break up the security mechanisms for particularly global companies in ways that render them unsafe. I think we're looking and trading partners looking at that whole mix of issues determine what the appropriate remedies are. I can't say yet whether we would think a WTO action would be sufficiently, that we believe it would be sufficiently likely to succeed
heft.
for us to try it yet. But I do think we have a variety of mechanisms, including our bilateral discussions. I mean, there are some outcomes in the SNED this week, ensuring that in the area of cybersecurity, affirming that companies can use globally competitive software and security solutions, again, as a way of trying to instill that China-only solutions are not acceptable as the means of addressing cybersecurity. We have our ongoing bilateral investment treaty discussions, our BIT discussions, where issues around cross-border data flow are an important part of what we are discussing with China. It has not been agreed to, but are discussing with China. So I think we're looking at a variety of these. I'll also say that while China's not part of TPP, and TPP is not primarily about China, the additional leverage and support we get around things like the Digital 2 allows this issue not to just be a U.S.-China bilateral issue, but it allows it to be 40% of the global economy embracing these provisions and pointing out the direction of openness that we think is important.
Thank you. All right, we have time for a couple of questions. You've been very patient. Right here, and I think we have a microphone. Somebody will come up, and she's coming behind you. Please identify yourself.
Hi, thanks for putting on this event. Jack Capperell with Inside U.S. Trade, and my question is for the ambassador. You've made a strong case for rules against data localization here today, and there have been complaints from members of Congress about the data localization carve-out for financial services in TPP. I understand the administration has made a proposal to fix that in the TISA. And so my question is, first, when will cleared advisors be able to see the legal text? Second, when will you propose it at in the TISA negotiations? And then third, given the fact that there are a number of TPP partners in TISA who seemingly rejected removing the prohibition on data localization for financial services in TPP, what makes you confident that they would accept to do so in TISA?
Well, let me start by answering the last question first, which is, TPP cannot be renegotiated, and we can't take bits and pieces of TPP and reopen it for negotiation. So when we've had issues like this, we've tried to look for alternative ways that we could address the concerns of members of Congress and others. And we are currently working to identify, particularly with Congress, whether or not the structure that's now been created with the support of the regulators, the financial regulators, who have to be key parts of this because they have obligations, and financial services have obligations to work with those regulators. So data needs to be made available. So we have worked to develop what we think is a mechanism that will succeed in this. But what I want to also say that is equally important is that there has never been any trade agreement that the U.S. has ever negotiated that has made it impermissible for countries to require that data be stored in their country in all sectors. There's no trade agreements that prohibit forced localization of data. TPP is the first trade agreement in history that ever has a provision against forced localization of data. That is a broad, strong provision that applies to 80+% of the U.S. economy. So on the 80-20 rule, 80% of the U.S. economy has, through TPP, a benefit in this area that we have never achieved in any other trade agreement. For the 20%, roughly, that is represented by financial services, our regulators had concerns because they require certain data to be held in the United States to meet their regulatory purposes. And so the TPP agreement reflected that concern of the regulators. But with the urging of Congress and others, we've gone back to the table with the regulators to determine if there might be another way of crafting this for future agreements that would allow regulators to get the information they need, but still give financial services more similar benefits to the 80% of the economy that secured a provision for the first time. And that's the balance that we're working on achieving.
Dealing with Treasury and trade agreements. Anything else is really tough. I remember the famous story of the Treasury agent in a trade negotiation in the 1980s who finally just slapped his hand on the table, left the room, and said, "We do not intend to exchange the U.S. financial regulatory system for chicken parts." And they usually, in any Democrat or Republican administration, they have the whip hand. So I understand what you're dealing with here. Okay, we'll take two more questions. I'm a little blind here, if there is another one. Am I missing somebody in the back? Okay, well, listen, let us join me, please. Oh, I'm sorry, right here.
Right, sorry.
I'm missing somebody right in front of me. These lights are really...
Thank you, Rita Chen from Central News Agency, Taiwan. Thank you, Robert, for your comprehensive introduction. My question is about the U.S.-Taiwan's economic relation. What's the U.S. position on Taiwan's interest in joining TPP? And I also wonder that how the pork issue will influence whether or not Taiwan is qualified to have a membership of TPP. Thank you.
Sure. Well, interesting question. I will say that Taiwan is one of 11 or 12 economies who have expressed an interest in potentially becoming part of TPP in the future. We believe, though, it is premature for us to talk about any new entrants until we know that we have TPP that our own country has approved. And so the 12 parties of the TPP represent a critical and important mass, and we are doing everything to ensure that we get it approved here, that the other countries who are part of TPP are addressing through the changes in laws that are necessary to ensure they come into compliance, that we have implementation, and that we can certify compliance. After that, we will be in a position to determine whether or not other economies are ready to embrace the high standards that are part of TPP. So we are, know of the interest from both Taiwan and other economies, but it's premature to do anything about that. And I would say that on the bilateral relationship, there are a number of outstanding issues between the U.S. and Taiwan around pork, around beef, and others, and encourage Taiwan to work to try to resolve those issues, because certainly when I go to Congress, those are the issues that are raised to us about commitments Taiwan has already made that they need to live up to. And I would hope that would be an important part of Taiwan's calculation as they consider whether or not they may or may not in the future want to be part of TPP, assuming we get to a point that where we can consider that.
Okay, one more right here.
Thank you. My name is Mitsuo Nakai. My question is, can you break it down to percentage per trade projections? For example, how many percentage are you expecting per Japan and down so forth?
For the digital components, I really can't do it that way. I mean, there are a variety of sectors. Agriculture is a great example where those benefits can be calculated with precision. The digital components are much more sweeping, and so it doesn't lend itself to sort of breaking that down as well. Two last points I will make. One of the ways that we were able to get such a sweeping set of provisions in TPP is because we are at the early stages of these barriers being erected. And it's always easier to get a set of rules that prevent barriers from going in place than it is to get the barriers eliminated once they're in place. So part of this is, in answer to your question, is that we're fortunate that barriers are not the default that we have to break down. If they were the default, you could better quantify what the value would be. But we're trying to get out there as a kind of first mover advantage. And then the second part of this is the point that I would end with, which is about urgency and speed. You know, that this is an important agreement. It is an important agreement for fast-moving, innovative industries. And what I will say as a trade negotiator is that the additional influence and strength that has come to the U.S. simply by virtue of the conclusion of TPP is hard to overstate. We have not only a stronger relationship with the parties in TPP, but it is because of that leadership that we now have stronger bilateral trade relationships. People see that the U.S. has been able to put together a diverse group of economies around high standards, around a high level of ambition. And that is important not only for TPP, but that is important in our other bilateral negotiations and our other plurilateral. And so one cannot overstate the importance of this. We also know that whoever the next president is, he or she will be enormously benefited by having TPP in place. They will have the tools around implementation and certification in all of the areas of TPP that will fall within their purview to ensure they're done. So that ability to engage, that ability to ensure high standards will be a hugely invaluable tool. And finally, for all of those bilateral relationships in which we engage, he or she will be much stronger from day one with the U.S. in a position of leadership on trade. And so whether you are a business who needs the value of innovating and you need to move quickly, or you are a trade negotiator now or in the near future in the U.S., TPP is critical and indeed essential to ensure that we can negotiate as strongly and for the kind of high standards that are encompassed in the Digital 2 Dozen.
Thank you, Robert. Please join me in thanking Ambassador Holleyman for a great, great performance. Thank you.